Every Souls-like I play ends up falling into one of two categories. It is Sekiro, or it isn't. I've noticed that newer Souls-likes tend to model themselves more closely to Sekiro than the original Souls trilogy. These games have been trying to catch up to Sekiro, whether they admit it or not. Sekiro is an amazing game, and I highly recommend anyone who hasn't to give it a try. It was Game of the Year for a reason. So what did FromSoftware do so differently here that it literally changed the entire genre? In this video, I want to break down the 6 perfectly designed aspects of Sekiro, to look at how it has become the new model for Souls-likes, and how those aspects contributed to its major success. Then, looking at how newer Souls-likes have added these features to improve themselves. Now, let's get into it. Let's start by talking about Souls-likes. There are 3 Souls-likes that I've played that I praise for being like Sekiro: Lies of P, The First Berserker Kazan, and 9 Souls. There are certainly others, like the Neo series, and Thymesia, which I haven't yet played. Souls-likes are my favorite genre of video games. I would consider it a subgenre of action RPGs, but the definition has been stretched as of late. Games like Hollow Knight and Cuphead are considered Souls-likes for some. In its base form, Souls-likes just means like Souls, which is why so many people disagree on what counts as Souls-like. I think games like Sekiro are quite different from the original Souls series and many of FromSoftware's games. I like to say this: Dark Souls is an action RPG, while Sekiro is an action RPG. Which is why the first aspect of Sekiro that makes it amazing is the action. Many of FromSoftware's games and other Souls-likes focus on exploration, builds, and non-linearity. These aspects are fun and allow for various player expressions, but I much prefer a refined combat with fewer weapons. Compared to Sekiro's predecessors in FromSoftware's library, Sekiro has a bigger focus on bosses and combat. If there's one thing that Sekiro does perfectly, it would be the combat. It's extremely well refined and should be the main draw to any player interested in playing the game. In a way, the difference between Sekiro and other Souls-likes reminds me of meta progression in roguelites. In roguelites with meta progression, as you get better at the game, you gain more tools to beat the higher difficulties. In games without meta progression, you simply have to improve your own skill. In other Souls-likes, you can often outlevel challenges, especially with vitality, and especially if the bosses are non-linear and you fight a boss later than you would expect. While Sekiro has some non-linear aspects, most bosses will still be at the same difficulty for each person's individual experience. Almost every encounter is sword-based, which makes it easier to figure out parry timings and rhythm. These encounters also fit the theme of the game. Even a boss like Guardian Ape would seem beast-like at first, until he pulls out the sword for phase 2. The bosses all feature Sekiro's combat mechanics extremely well, and that's what I'd like to talk about next. Sekiro's mechanics are what make both its levels and bosses shine. Can we start off by mentioning they finally added a real jump to a FromSoftware game. Before this, the Dark Souls 3 jump was abysmal, rarely used and completely neglected for boss fights. I think Ancient Wyvern might be the only boss I jumped for, and it wasn't even a jump, just a fall off of a ledge. Sekiro's jump quite literally adds a whole new dimension to the game. I think the grappling hook is one of the best mechanics they've added to Sekiro, as it adds to the shinobi aesthetic, while also being exciting to use in both combat and exploration. The jumping and grappling allows Sekiro to finally add verticality not only to their fights, but to their levels as well. You're able to scale mountains and ravines with the hook and leap across areas. However, my biggest complaint about Sekiro's level design would be the lack of rewards for exploring. At best, you can find gourd seeds or prayer beads from elite enemies. There's not too much lore you can find around either, or weapons to take from enemies like other games. I personally don't mind these aspects as I love the movement in the game, which makes exploration fun. The game has a lot of combat mechanics. As mentioned before, the grappling hook is also used in combat, and boss fights including Gyobu, Guardian Ape, Demon of Hatred, Divine Dragon, and True Corrupted Monk. Additionally, mechanics like the Mikiri counter encourage you to play aggressively, as you have to dodge towards enemies. There are many combat arts as well which Sekiro can use, such as the Mortal Blade, which does damage through blocks. Combat arts are Sekiro's version of taking weapons from enemies, as they are often skills that enemies use, such as the Ichimonji double, which is used by a variety of enemies including bosses. They are also part of Sekiro's builds alongside the shinobi prosthetics. Some prosthetics are defensive, like the Umbrella, Mist Raven, and the Divine Abduction. Others are used offensively, like the Sabimaru, Axe, Spear, Firecrackers, Shurikens, and Flames. These are Sekiro's version of problem-solving bosses. You can change your prosthetic to fit each boss. In games like Dark Souls 3, the bosses have certain weaknesses and resistances, making different builds stronger. You can problem solve bosses by targeting their weaknesses, and so everyone's playthrough of Dark Souls 3 is unique. People will inevitably find different bosses more difficult and result in varying experiences. To be clear, this isn't necessarily a negative. Many people like when their experience is different from others. But this often leads to unbalanced bosses. Additionally, vitality is extremely powerful in Souls-like games. As such, Sekiro is one of the most difficult Souls-likes. You can't change your damage or your health beyond a certain point, as the items to increase them, battle memories and prayer beads, are locked behind areas or bosses. This leads to my next point. Sekiro is the most fair Souls-like. Despite having some non-linear aspects which can make certain bosses more difficult than others, the game is very well balanced for this. The amount of bosses you defeat changes the time of day, making bosses harder depending on the order you beat them, and makes them more balanced to your progression. This also changes the difficulty of areas because some enemies will only appear at a specific time of day. You're not able to progress past a certain point until you beat a specific boss. This balances the experience for everyone. You simply have to get good at every boss. There's no summons, no real builds, and there is no Queen of England. Miyazaki had an interview about Sekiro and said, "We don't want to include a difficulty selection because we want to bring everyone to the same level of discussion and the same level of enjoyment. So we want everyone to first face that challenge and to overcome it in some way that suits them as a player." This quote was very enlightening to me about the difficulties of FromSoftware's games. Their goal is to have everyone at a level playing field. Sekiro is the best possible example of this in all of their games. With only a skill tree to differentiate players, everyone goes through the same experiences fighting bosses. Everyone overcomes the same obstacles, and everyone can talk about the bosses on equal footing. The game's progression is also relatively limited. The skill tree doesn't provide a significant change in gameplay outside of the Mikiri counter, which is unlocked very early on. This is especially so since the Mortal Blade is almost undoubtedly the strongest combat art. The changes in prosthetics are also minimal. The base version will do even up till the final boss. This means that there isn't a point in grinding enemies to become stronger. You can't outlevel challenges, you simply have to overcome them. If anything, you're improving yourself instead of your character. It's the purest skill expression FromSoftware has made. This goes doubly so for the final boss, Ishin the Sword Saint. When I was going back to beat every boss, I did research on each boss before fighting it, their strengths, weaknesses, and ways to defeat them easier. Ishin, however, has no such methods. At best, you can get a couple extra hits in with the Shinobi Firecracker, but prosthetics aren't especially useful against him. There aren't many great combat arts either. You simply have to understand his combos, parry his attacks, and defeat him. He and Genichiro are really what the point of Sekiro is. The fights are just two swordsmen clashing weapons, searching for openings, and one coming out on top. No distractions, no gimmicks, just pure combat. Ishin is definitely a highlight as a boss, but that's not the only boss who is amazing in this lineup. That's why the next reason I would say every game should be Sekiro is the focus on bosses. I would argue that Dark Souls 3 is when FromSoftware first began to realize that bosses were their bread and butter. Sekiro, however, is where it really starts to shine. I hadn't thought much of Sekiro's bosses before I went back and hitlist all of them. In my mind, the only ones that I thought were 10 out of 10 were Genichiro, Owl Father, and Ishin the Sword Saint. The game still has FromSoft's signature gimmick bosses, such as Divine Dragon and Folding Screen Monkeys, which are the only reason I don't consider this game to have a higher boss quality than Kazan, the game which I do consider to have the highest boss quality. However, the 3 10 out of 10 bosses definitely surpass many of Kazan's bosses, and are some of my favorite of all time. Ishin in particular is only second to the final boss of Lies of P Overture. The swordsman boss fights, unique designs, and fun mechanics to interact with make Sekiro's bosses extremely compelling. Stomping on enemies' heads and Mikiri countering are very fun mechanics which prevent the fights from becoming purely parrying. The Mikiri counter is cool both visually and in concept, stomping on a swordsman's sword to give yourself an opening to attack. Not to mention the shinobi prosthetics, combat arts, and grappling hook. The mechanical complexity of Sekiro is something I love about the game. The Souls trilogy can be mostly distilled into dodging and hitting, which can get stale if bosses are too similar. Many long combos from the boss are best dealt with by positioning and keeping your distance, rather than dodging each attack in the combo. Which is why I'm glad that many Souls-like games, like Sekiro, also have much more mechanical complexity. Even bosses that many people don't particularly like are great. I feel that they provide a unique experience to the game, and are actually a great refresher outside of the 10 out of 10 swordsman fights. Demon of Hatred, Headless Ape, and Guardian Ape are extremely well-designed fights without fitting the usual Sekiro experience. Demon of Hatred is mostly dodge-based and challenges your consistency and positioning. It deals a significant amount of damage each hit, so it's important to dodge all of them. That is, while keeping up the pressure with your own attacks. Headless Ape is a duo fight which I think is extremely well designed. In general, I would say that the best gank fights are ones where each combatant takes turns attacking, such as the Black Rabbit Brotherhood or Markiona from Lies of P. The first phase is the same as Guardian Ape's second phase, so it is reused, but I don't mind that. The second phase has a rhythm of each combatant taking turns to attack, depending on each of their actions. For example, the Headless Ape screams to signal the other ape to attack, making it clear which combatant you will fight. Lastly, the Guardian Ape is an amazing fight with great rhythm even if the boss seems beast-like. His combos are fun to both dodge and parry, and he has an extremely memorable phase transition. His phase 2 is completely different, which makes him fun to learn. This second phase is more heavily benefited from parrying, as you're able to parry their attacks relatively easily, and are able to build that posture. This is added on to by the cool feature of being able to pull out the centipede with the spear prosthetic, since the Guardian Ape body is technically its armor. This does ridiculous posture damage and rewards you for keeping up that aggression, which is what I'd like to talk about next. Sekiro rewards aggression. This game has a heavy focus on being aggressive, which adds to the action part of the game. Bosses like Ishin Ashina, Genichiro Ashina, and the Great Shinobi Owl can become predictable with their counterattacks if you stay on the aggressive side. They tend to counterattack in the same way, so you have to learn less of their combos when consistently dealing damage to them. This means that, somewhat counterintuitively, backing off actually increases danger and variety. Additionally, the majority of bosses will be killed from the posture bar. Essentially, posture is a boss's stamina bar, which is the main mechanic by which you defeat bosses. This and the death blow system are the most unique parts of Sekiro, which are absolutely genius additions to the game. Giving enemies death blows is extremely satisfying and make for great phase transitions. Posture also heavily rewards aggressive combat because you are able to defeat a boss way earlier than draining their health bar. They essentially have a constantly regenerating health bar, which can be depleted by attacking and parrying their attacks. This has had the community make the joke, Sekiro is so hard that the health bar has a health bar. While it's somewhat exaggerated, this saying is also very true. It's important to keep being aggressive and not be greedy while healing. Running away gets you killed and allows the boss to regenerate their posture. Remember, hesitation is defeat. Compare this to Dark Souls 3. The game mostly rewards patience. You are expected to wait for bosses' combos to finish before you get an opening to attack. In Sekiro, you are more able to set up enemies how you want by forcing them to deflect your attacks. You are rarely able to do this in Dark Souls 3, since most bosses have hyper armor, allowing them to be unfazed by your attacks. The bosses are what create openings for you, instead of being able to create your own openings. Creating your own openings gives you a greater sense of control in the fight, which makes the game more fun. As Miyazaki said, FromSoftware wants you to overcome challenges in a way that suits you as a player. And there's no better way to do that than essentially give you full control over how the fights can go. By constantly pressuring and attacking, you're the tempo setter instead of the reactor. Since filling bosses' posture bar is the main method of killing them, this means that any way to fill that bar will be extremely useful. This doesn't just include shinobi prosthetics and attacking the boss, but also learning to parry bosses. Each boss kill gets exponentially faster as you're learning their patterns while also doing damage. Sekiro is the first FromSoftware game to make parrying their main mechanic, and that's what I would like to talk about next. Parrying versus dodging. Parrying is inherently aggressive, while dodging is generally defensive. When you parry, you are face to face with the boss. You have to stay close to parry the bosses and figure out the rhythm. For dodging, it's much more about spacing, and many times it can be effective to just dodge away from bosses. I much prefer learning a boss's rhythm than learning their spacing. Spacing is often not something you can learn in your first try, because you have to understand the range of their attacks, and that's something you cannot tell at first glance. For me personally, the rhythm of attacks is much more intuitive to figure out. As I've mentioned earlier, parrying also does damage. Posture is a boss's real health bar, and parrying their attacks is the most effective way to build up this bar. Doing damage doesn't do as much posture damage, but slows posture regeneration over time. Even parrying can be a final blow to finish off enemies. In fact, it often is. Dodging, however, feels more like a necessity. You have to avoid enemies' attacks so that you don't take damage. Sometimes you can go several combos in without getting an opening to attack a boss. With parrying, you're always attacking bosses. Your parry does damage, and you're always nearby to be able to punish bosses after their combos. I personally like the feeling of whittling down a boss slowly with small attacks. Being able to constantly feel like you're making progress towards beating a boss, rather than hoping for an opening during their combos. Parrying is also rhythmic. You can hear the sounds of parrying, which you can't by dodging. You've likely already seen the dozens of videos out there about Sekiro being a rhythm game, and I'm not here to disagree. Long combos especially have rhythmic parrying and follow patterns. In my guide for beating all the Sekiro bosses hitless, I sometimes count out loud the boss's combo attacks as it's easier to remember the rhythm. I always remember the attack as 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Because of which, when it clicks in your brain, it's hard to forget. They say that the people who best remember information employ strategies to remember, and having a rhythm definitely helps. This makes Sekiro significantly easier on following playthroughs. The rhythms are locked into your mind, and you're able to parry and enter a flow state you might not even be aware of. This rhythm also changes how developers go about making bosses. I find that bosses in dodge-based games like Dark Souls 3 don't have great rhythm. They can often spam projectiles or use a long combo chain, which you can simply walk away from. You aren't meant to learn the rhythm of many boss combos. This results in many parts of bosses feeling boring, as there can be a lot of downtime with long combos. Instead of parrying and chipping away their health, for dodge-based games, you simply have to wait for them to finish their combos. Parrying, however, forces the developers to make more elaborate and intentional attacks. Sekiro doesn't have a great implementation of the dodge, since it's much too weak, but it still has at least one positioning and dodge-based fight. That would be the Demon of Hatred. It's important to stay close to the boss, as he often does long-range fire attacks. Additionally, dodging is less precise than parrying. Oftentimes, dodging gives you a ton of invincibility frames compared to parrying. You can often dodge much earlier than when an attack actually lands, simply because of the leeway granted by those extra invincibility frames. This also contributes to the lack of rhythmic feeling. You are giving up control for the entire dodge animation and can't do anything during that time. The developers have to wait for you to roll and get up, and as such can't have any sort of fast-paced rhythm for their combos. So to summarize, here's why I think parrying as a mechanic is better than dodging. Parrying is inherently aggressive, staying near the bosses and doing damage to the bosses at the same time. Dodging, on the other hand, is something you have to do rather than meaningfully working towards beating the boss. Dodging is less precise with a larger window, making it feel less rhythmic. Lastly, parrying allows developers to make faster bosses. They don't have to wait for your roll animation to continue their combos. Now, let's talk about Sekiro-Likes. As mentioned before, Sekiro marks the change in Souls-like games from mostly being dodge-focused to being parry-focused. Kazan, Lies of P, and Nine Souls all clearly took inspiration from Sekiro. These three have unique additions to Sekiro's mechanics. The first Berserker Kazan takes the parry and aggressive gameplay from Sekiro. Some bosses have white stamina, meaning they regenerate stamina if you don't stay aggressive, very similar to the posture system of Sekiro. The game feels like it could be a spiritual successor to Sekiro. Not only do you have to learn boss combos, but you also have to learn to interweave your own combos into the openings. You're rewarded for both parrying and dodging in this game, which both give you spirit gauge, which can be used in combos. In this way, you are rewarded for learning and interacting with boss combos, making each fight faster as you learn it more, like Sekiro. Lies of P's bosses have a hidden stamina bar which is depleted when the player parries them. When that stamina bar is empty, if you hit the boss with a heavy attack, it will stagger them, giving you a huge window to deal damage and also do a fatal attack, which deals a great chunk of health. In a way, this encourages staying near the boss and being aggressive because you have to land a hit to open the stagger window. Additionally, there's upgrades which let you regain lost health and even sharpen your weapon through perfect parrying. To show even more similarities, Lies of P also has their own version of the shinobi prosthetic, which would be the Legion arms. They each have different abilities and can be leveled up to increase in strength. Legion arms also use a meter which depletes with usage. Lastly, we have Nine Souls. Of all the Sekiro-likes, this game is most similar to Sekiro, in more ways than even just the combat. The game's description even specifically says it has Sekiro-inspired deflection. Like Sekiro, it has a grappling hook and skill tree. You also inflict internal damage with a parry, which is their version of dealing damage with deflection. Stomping on enemies and crimson attacks are also unparryable, which come from Sekiro. I plan on making a full video on how 9 Souls improves a majority of Sekiro's mechanics and creates a uniquely compelling experience. While Sekiro may have solved what makes a Souls-like good, 9 Souls solved what makes Sekiro good. If you're interested, leave a comment below. The direction Souls-like games have gone because of Sekiro's influence is personally really exciting for me and has created some of my favorite games of all time. Lies of P, 9 Souls, and Kazan stand at the pinnacle of the games I've played, and of course Sekiro as well. Sekiro is perfect. Its introduction of parrying, its focus on bosses, and aggressive fighting, and of course its movement mechanics. It's a true test of skill. These aspects all make Sekiro one of the greatest games of all time, and shows really why every game should be Sekiro. These videos take a long time to make, so I would appreciate it if you could subscribe to see more. And remember, hesitation is defeat.